There is a quiet moment many people reach as they grow older, when a simple truth settles in the chest. Not with drama, not with bitterness, just a clear knowing. No one was coming to save me, and somehow I survived anyway. If you learned that early in life, it shaped you in ways few people ever fully see. As a child or a young adult, you may have looked around during moments of fear or confusion, waiting for someone to step in. A parent, a partner, a boss, an authority. And when help did not come, something inside you adjusted. Not loudly, not consciously, but deeply. You learned to read rooms before you spoke. You learned to sense moods before words were said. You learned to stay calm while your heart worked overtime. Empaths who learned early that no one was coming to save them did not become cold. They became precise. They became observant. They became quietly strong. At first, it did not feel like strength. It felt like loneliness. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from realizing you must carry yourself, not just physically, but emotionally. You learned that your feelings needed to be managed carefully because no one else was managing them for you. So you learned to soften yourself, to adapt, to understand others quickly, sometimes before understanding yourself. You became the one who noticed small changes in tone, the one who felt tension before anyone named it, the one who could tell when something was wrong, even when everyone smiled. This sensitivity was not encouraged. Often it was misunderstood. You may have been told you were too much, too emotional, too serious. Or, on the other side, you may have been praised for being mature, responsible, reliable, without anyone realizing what it cost you. You learned to self-regulate long before you learned to rest. When problems appeared, you did not panic outwardly. You went inward. You scanned possibilities. You asked yourself what could be done, instead of who could help. That habit followed you into adulthood. At work, you became dependable, the one who handles things, the one people lean on. Yet when you needed support, you hesitated. Not because you did not deserve it, but because asking felt unfamiliar, even unsafe. In relationships, you gave understanding easily. You listened deeply. You forgave quickly, sometimes too quickly. You learned how to hold space for others without making demands, because you learned early that making demands did not guarantee care. There is a quiet grief in that realization. Not a dramatic grief, a subtle one. The grief of knowing you grew strong because you had to, not because someone protected you while you grew. As the years pass, this grief often returns in unexpected ways. When you watch others being supported effortlessly, when you see younger people still allowed to lean, when you notice how quickly people assume you are fine, simply because you have always managed. You may have been overlooked, not because you lacked value, but because you never collapsed publicly. You learned how to hold yourself together so well that others stopped checking. That is one of the hidden costs of early emotional independence. Empaths like you often become invisible in plain sight. Capable, calm, quietly carrying more than anyone realizes. You may have noticed this in social settings. They talk, they vent, they lean. And when there is space for you to speak, you pause. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you are still assessing whether it is safe to say it, whether it will matter, whether it will be received. You learned early that not everyone can hold what you feel, so you learn to hold it yourself. This creates a particular posture toward life. You do not rush toward rescue. You do not wait for permission. You do not expect fairness. You prepare, you adapt, you endure. And yet, despite this toughness, your empathy did not disappear. It deepened. You understand pain without explanation. You sense exhaustion behind smiles. You recognize when someone is trying to be strong because they think they must. That recognition comes from lived experience. But here's where something important begins to shift, especially after midlife. There comes a time when the same strategies that once protected you begin to weigh on you. You realize that always being the strong one has left little room for softness, that always being understanding has sometimes meant being overlooked, that always being capable has allowed others to assume you do not need care. This realization can sting. It can bring quiet anger, or sadness, or simply fatigue. You may notice yourself withdrawing slightly, speaking less, choosing your words carefully, not because you are shrinking, but because you are conserving. This is not bitterness, it is discernment. Empaths who learned early that no one was coming to save them begin later in life
to act differently, not dramatically, subtly, powerfully. They stop explaining themselves to people who are not listening. They stop overgiving where there is no reciprocity. They stop proving their worth through endurance. You still care, but you no longer feel responsible for saving others at the cost of yourself. This is not a loss of empathy. It is empathy balanced with self-respect. You may also notice a new relationship with silence. Silence used to mean being alone with your thoughts, sometimes heavy ones. Now, silence becomes a refuge. A place where you do not have to perform understanding. A place where you can simply exist without scanning, without managing, without holding. You become comfortable letting conversations pass you by, letting misunderstandings remain uncorrected, letting people reveal themselves without interruption. This can confuse others. They may interpret your calm as distance, your quiet as indifference. But inside, something has settled.
You no longer chase recognition. You recognize yourself. There's a particular dignity that emerges here, a groundedness that does not seek validation. You have lived long enough to know that being unseen does not mean being insignificant, and being needed does not always mean being valued. You start choosing depth over approval, peace over explanation, truth over harmony. At work, you may pull back from roles that drain you. You may stop volunteering for emotional labor that goes unnoticed. You may become clearer in your boundaries, not aggressively, but firmly. In family relationships, you may stop smoothing over everything. You may allow discomfort to exist. You may allow others to feel the weight of their choices without rushing in to cushion the impact. This can feel uncomfortable at first. Old habits do not dissolve quietly, but there's relief in not carrying what was never yours. One of the most profound shifts for empaths like you is learning to receive, not dramatically, not perfectly, but gradually. You begin allowing small gestures of care to land, a kind word, an offer of help, a moment of attention. You notice the instinct to deflect it, to minimize it, to say you're fine, and sometimes you choose differently. You let yourself be seen, just a little. This does not mean you suddenly rely on others. You still trust yourself deeply, but you no longer confuse self-reliance with self-denial. You understand now that strength does not require isolation, and independence does not require emotional starvation. There is also a gentleness that develops toward your younger self. You may look back and recognize how much you carried without support, how early you learned to be composed, how often you chose understanding over being understood. And instead of judging that version of yourself, you feel compassion. You survived in the way you had to survive. That matters. As you age, your empathy becomes quieter but sharper. You no longer need to absorb everything to understand it. You can sense what belongs to you and what does not. You can care without merging. You can listen without losing yourself. People may come to you for wisdom, even if they do not call it that. They feel your steadiness, your lack of urgency, your grounded presence. They may not know why they feel calmer around you, but they do. This is earned presence. And yet, you no longer need to be everyone's anchor. You choose when to show up fully and when to step back. This is one of the most misunderstood transitions in emotionally mature people. Others may think you have become distant, when in reality you have become centered. You no longer rush toward chaos. You do not need to be needed. You need peace. And peace, once tasted, is not easily surrendered. You may find joy in simpler rhythms, walking without purpose, sitting without distraction, conversations that do not require emotional translation, moments where you do not have to anticipate anyone else's needs. These moments feel nourishing because they restore what was long deferred. Toward the later chapters of life, something else becomes clear. You were never weak for needing support. You were simply early to understand that survival required adaptation. Now you are wise enough to choose something different. You are allowed to rest without guilt. You are allowed to say no without explanation.
You are allowed to expect respect without performing resilience. There is nothing left to prove. Empaths who learned early that no one was coming to save them often become the calm center others rely on, but eventually they learn to be that center for themselves. This does not make life perfect, but it makes it honest. You feel sadness without drowning in it. You feel joy without bracing for loss. You feel connected without disappearing. That balance is rare, and it is hard-earned. As you sit with this understanding, there may be a quiet pride that arises, not loud, not boastful, just a steady acknowledgement. You carried yourself through things you never talk about. You adapted without applause. You learned to care deeply without being consumed. That is not small. And now, in this stage of life, you get to choose differently, not because you failed before, but because you finally can. You get to live with dignity that does not need to announce itself, with empathy that includes yourself, with strength that knows when to soften. No one came to save you, and somehow you became someone worth saving, especially to yourself. There is peace in that realization, a deep, settling peace, the kind that doesn't need words, the kind that feels like coming home.